start by talking about some things? Like, what I'd like to get at the beginning is a little bit about your background. I know that the thrust of what we're trying to do is show that Inuvialuit did a wonderful thing in the end. That they're able to do it through their own skills and abilities and know-how, that they brought the right people in to assist with the job as well. So we do want to reflect a little bit about how you got involved, your impressions of the whole process, the people you worked with. And if we can kind of develop a story here, a narrative that we'll talk about. First of all, you coming into the process, what it was like, how the negotiations proceeded, some of the hits and misses, the mistakes that might have been made, as well as some of the successes. Again, in the end, people will only realize how remarkable this was if they knew some of the problems that were associated with the problem.
Well, the way I look at it, Chuck, is that to really understand one of the points you're trying to get at here is you want to bookend the way things were before the final agreement, before negotiations and final agreement, the way things are now, and then, of course, the process of how you got there. Because clearly you won't understand a lot of the thinking behind the final agreement unless you know what we were trying to solve, so that's sort of the way I approach those things. But does that make sense?
It does. That's absolutely the way I'd like to look at it as well.
Sure.
So we're going to ask you to tell the story of the IFA and as you witnessed it, as you were involved with it.
Yep.
And we'd like to bring in some things too, Bob, that people might not be aware of. Like the IFA was not done in total isolation. There were a lot of political things that were going on. There was, I don't know if activism was the right term for all of this.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly there was a sense of awakening. Aboriginal people were saying it's about time that we began to take control of our destiny in the future. And I think these are the kinds of things that we'd like to do as well.
And we may have to take more than one swing at that too. I mean, that's a big story in itself. Yeah.
And maybe we could just begin, Bob, then by telling us how you got involved with COPE and the negotiations.
Well, maybe it's a bit of a long story, but I got exposed to the Arctic through being a fisheries biologist up in Old Crow, and we worked on the Old Crow Flats and the North Slope and Herschel Island. And this was part of the environmental assessment process for the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline. So it was a big project, and they threw a lot of money at it. So in 1970, went into Old Crow and began work up there. And I got exposed to the North Slope and Herschel Island and the local Gwich'in people there. And it was a bit of a rough go of it with the bureaucracy and fisheries there, because they didn't really want to do research. And I remember it got a showdown because nobody in our team had ever done freshwater fisheries research before, and I'd spent probably 5 or 6 summers working in Ontario in the Great Lakes, and they had a very sophisticated fisheries research program. So these guys had no idea what they were doing. They didn't know how to use the gear. They didn't know what information to take, and so I set up the whole program. Once I got up there, and I saw they didn't know what they were doing. So at the end of it all, I applied for some computer time to analyze my data. So I had to go to my boss, and I asked him for this $10,000 of computing time. And he said, "What for?" And I said, "Well, to analyze the data." He said, "What data?" I said, "Well, the data I've been working on for 3 years." "Oh, well, you weren't supposed to collect data. You were supposed to go up there and fly around and get an impression about it." I said, "What?" So I quit. And I became a carpenter. And I was very successful at that, became a foreman on a high-rise. And my dad was starting to get a bit concerned because I was doing too well in that. He wanted to get me back to biology. So a friend of his at the University of Toronto, Doug Pimlott, who was a member of the Canadian Arctic Resources, had taken a year off and went up on a field worker program in working with COPE. And he saw there was a tremendous need for some good biological resources in there to help people out because they just needed it at that point in time. So he recruited me to go up there, and Nellie had to interview me, and she was just coming back from Ottawa at that point in time from making the pitch on the Husky Lakes land freeze, which ended up in the final agreement. And I guess they were very successful. So anyway, it worked out. I said, sure, I'll go up there and work for a while and see if I can help out. And so Doug says, great, go ahead. So I got up there in beginning of June 1975 into Inuvik, and that was my exposure up there. And I started working in this field worker program, the field worker program of CARCS. And I got really involved in the oil and gas exploration, trying to make sense of trying to mitigate problems and avoid problems. And by that time, COPE had managed to get land use regulations in place. Before COPE, there were no land use regulations. There was no management of seismic or oil and gas drilling or anything. It was left totally up to companies. And COPE initiated on Banks Island a big kerfuffle up there. So Jean Chrétien came up, he was the Minister of Indian Affairs, and agreed to set up the territorial land use regulations. Well, it's hard to imagine life before, just being totally unregulated to what it is today. And then she moved it on into the Cape Bathurst and Husky Lakes land freeze. And so that's right at the point in time I came in. So I got us involved in screening all these applications for land use permits put in by the oil companies. So as I understand it, the oil companies first started up there in 1958 in seismic in the Delta. And people have been having real problems. Like they built Bar C right on top of somebody's camp, for example, and they just do cut lines through their trap lines, and it was a real Wild West there. So with the land use regulations and with our consultation involved in them, we could at least prevent some of this stuff from happening. But at the peak up there, we were getting between 50 and 100 applications for land use permits there. And that's a tremendous load. I mean, each one of these things was 50 pages long. So we had to review all those and make our comments, and so that occurred once a month. And then I got involved in some of the offshore drilling issues. Doug Pimlott before me was quite concerned about the prospect of a blowout under the ice, and he wrote that book, Oil Under the Ice. And so that was a feature of a lot of the work that was going on. And the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline Inquiry was started to review the pipeline, and Tom Berger was the judge put in charge of that. And COPE was given the means to get a big team together, biologists, sociologists, geographers, lawyer, and they were a really, really good team. And they managed to talk Berger into adding to his inquiry the North Slope and Beaufort Sea. So we got a chance to bring a lot of experts in, and had a good hearing. And on the North Slope, it was really interesting, but our crew managed to talk the Murrays from Alaska into coming over and testifying. Now, they were the people that set up the, on the Alaskan side, the Wilderness Reserve. The Murrays were both husband and wife, Olaus and Marty, were responsible for setting that up, and they spent a year or two before they got, doing the field work. And they thought it was a spectacular, rich area. And they came over to Berger, and they were suggesting, I think you should do the same thing on the Canadian side. And I don't know, that plus other things, I think, convinced Berger that a wilderness park, a special wilderness park, should be set up on the whole North Slope. So that eventually led to what we have today. At the agreement in principle stage, Canada had agreed to wilderness park on the whole North Slope, and of course that led to tremendous objections from the Yukon. But the federal government was prepared to do that at that point. And interestingly, historically, right after we got the agreement in principle, which set that whole area aside, withdrew it from development for this purpose of wilderness area, the states was going into hearings to open up their 1002 lands, which was the protected lands on the American North Slope, to oil and gas exploration, because it had been shut down there. And Neil Faulkner, the Minister of Indian Affairs, intervened on Canada's behalf to the states, Udall, I think, Minister of the Interior at the time, not to do that, because Canada was doing this on this side, and they should keep a contiguous area. So it was kind of interesting how the states helped us out, get that, and then we were able to help them in preserving the integrity of that.
Now, so the North Slope, was it of interest in itself, or was there a plan to build a lateral line of the pipeline? What instigated the...
Yes. The whole reason I was in Old Crow, and we were studying the North Slope as well, is they wanted to bring the gas out of Prudhoe Bay, which is on the Alaskan coast, across northern Canada, and hook into the Mackenzie line. That was, I think, a bit of the financial justification for building the pipeline then, because I don't think we had enough reserves of our own at that point in time to justify the line.
And you mentioned CARC, Canadian Arctic Resources Committee. Did you work for them?
Yes.
Okay, so you worked with them before you became part of the COPE team, the committee.
Well, I was part of the COPE team, in a sense, on loan from Canadian Arctic Resources Committee.
Okay.
So then what happened was, at that point, I was working on the land use wildlife side of things, and Nellie was the ITC representative in their land claims in the Nunavut proposal. So she had started all the field work there. She had, and the crew had developed the ITC proposal, and it was submitted in 1976. It was in, I forget what the date was. Anyway, it was a big to-do. And Nellie, after it was made public, she asked me to have a look at it, and I said, well, yeah, it's pretty good in a lot of areas, but it's pretty weak in the wildlife side. So this was when still ITC was in negotiations. She asked me to write up what the wildlife sections might look like, just to give them some idea. So I did that. So that was my exposure to land claims. And then when ITC withdrew its proposal, poor old COPE was left sort of holding the bag, because of all the Arctic, COPE was the only one in immediate threat of development, if you like. Everybody else had time to play around, I guess. But Cope and Agnes and everyone in the Western Arctic said, no, we got to get going on this. So that's when the decision was taken to go into a regional claim. And so there was quite a process involved there. A referendum was taken among the Inuvialuit to see if that's what they wanted to do. And they said yes. Now, the Alaskans and the Inuvialuit were kind of close. And Alaska had gone through its land claims process, and they just hammered it into the Inuvialuit. You cannot have development before you get a land claim settlement. That's all there is to it. And so that became a bit of a slogan among the Inuvialuit. No, everything's on hold until we get this done, but we got to get off, off neutral and get this thing underway. So that's what sort of prompted the decision to go regionally. And at that point in time, I guess I'd worked with the Inuvialuit long enough that they had confidence of what I was doing, and so they asked me to be their negotiator. So I said, yeah, sure, I'll give it a try, but you got to realize, Nellie, this is a 1 in a million chance. This is a long shot. This is not going to be an easy deal. And she says, I know. So that was the sort of pragmatic realism that we brought to bear at that point in time. So the ratification vote was taken. We had to go through ITC at that point to tell them this is what we wanted to do, and we got their endorsement. Everyone but Vince Steens. Vince Steen fought this all the way. And he was the vice president at ITC at that point in time. And then we had to get Indian Affairs approval. So there were a lot of approvals we had to get along the way. And we finally got everybody on side, and we got the green light to go into a regional claim. So I was charged with this task of getting our team together and get a proposal drafted up. And it was my opinion, meeting the resource team of ITC, an absolutely top flight group of people. Don Gamble was the executive director, a very fine man. He used to work with the GNWT. Very fine man. And he was in charge of the whole thing. They had Everett Peterson on there, who's another big name in the environmental wildlife side. They had Peter Cumming, who was a well-known lawyer, and they had Pedro Van Meurs on oil and gas. Again, just a world-class guy. So I talked with Peter Cumming and Pedro to see if they'd like to come on in the same capacities and making a regional claim. And they said, yeah. So then I knew the sort of history behind the ITC claim, so I knew sort of generally what I had to do. And the first thing I had to do, which was one of the first things ITC did in their claim, was to get Peter Usher back in again to regionalize the land use and occupancy study.
Can we talk about that a little bit?
Sure.
This point? Okay, and again, I want to step back a little bit. And so there's a few new things that you've mentioned that I hadn't heard before. COPE began in 1970 formally when they registered as a society. And at some point became a regional affiliate, I'm
yes.
not sure I'm using the right word,
yes.
of Inuit Taupriset of Canada's
yes.
land claim process, which eventually became known as the Nunavut Proposal.
Yes.
Did COPE exist independently of ITC for a while, or was it?
Oh yes, they were. COPE started off, as I understand it, and Peter Usher, I think, wrote a bit of the history of this. It started out as representing all Native peoples. So they were Inuvialuit, Métis, Gwich'in, and then at some point in time, I just don't quite remember the history right now, but at some point in time, these other organizations started, like the Indian Brotherhood and Métis Association, things like that. And a decision was made at one of these meetings that the Gwich'in component of COPE should be turned over to the Indian Brotherhood, and same with the Métis organization. So this became strictly Inuvialuit. So because they represented the Inuvialuit and ITC represented the Inuit, if you like, COPE was an enclave, if you like, within ITC. So they were always a bit separate because they were Inuvialuit, but they were part of the whole land claims movement.
Do you know where the term Inuvialuit came from? Did it begin at that time, or?
It was always there, I guess, if you like. And it was interesting because I remember before when we were talking about going regionally, we were talking with William Nasagalawak, because it was always Inuit up to that point in time.
Mm-hmm.
He said, we're not Inuit, we're Inuvialuit. So, yeah, everybody agreed.
Meaning real.
Yeah, the real people, yeah.
People.
Yeah, according to my memory, the explanation I heard was Inuit just means a person rather than a dog, and Inuvialuit is the real deal. That's how I remember it anyway. It was a good enough explanation for me.
Sounds like really messy.
Yeah. So.
It sounds like COPE really, although there was this break from ITC, it sounds like it wasn't a complete divorce.
No.
No. Were there hard feelings when COPE left ITC?
Yep. And as best I could see, I mean, they were all friends. It wasn't a personal problem. ITC was adrift in terms of their land claims movement. COPE was gung-ho ahead, and so they didn't like that. But that got itself sorted out. So we'll talk about this later, but when you start getting towards a settlement, you've got to start talking about boundaries, and then there are always overlap issues, and how you're going to share common resources, all kinds of things like that. So naturally, once we moved from the Nunavut proposal into the Inuvialuit settlement, these boundary issues all came up with ITC, but they came up with everybody else too. It came up with Old Crow, and it came up with the Gwich'in. Mm-hmm. So they were all being settled.
Now, looking back, had COPE not decided to pursue a regional claim and ITC went through what they had to do and picked up the ball again, do you think the Inuvialuit settlement region as we know it today would be part of the Nunavut territory that we know today? Just that one of these historical blips in the process.
Yeah, that's entirely possible. But the reality COPE was facing is offshore drilling and pipeline were looming in the immediate future. One thing is for sure is that the settlement wouldn't have been achieved before all that happened. Now, the other thing, I just thought about this now, is that because we were under development pressure, it created quite a good environment for us to negotiate a good settlement. Like, nobody else got the lands and the resources and money that we did. And that's presumably because the circumstances were just right, where it was worth it to the federal government and everybody to get this thing settled.
Mm-hmm. So you got industry, oil and gas industry, pushing. They wanted certainty over what they could do in the area. they had the year of government, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes.
I suppose. Now, there was a broader context of things that were happening in Canada. There was the Calder decision in British Columbia, the whole idea of Aboriginal rights was being developed. There were groups in various parts of Canada saying, this is our land, we want to have control over it. The federal government was looking for ways to respond to all these demands. And they came up with their comprehensive land claims policy in either 1973 or 1974, depending.
73. Yeah.
There was the statement by John Kretchen.
Yeah.
Now, was that a surprise? I mean, were you involved? I'm not saying you were involved with the policy statement, but you were in the North at that time?
No, I didn't. No. Well, I was in Old Crow. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but I didn't. I was doing fisheries work. I wasn't listening to the radio or reading very much. So
I've always been a bit curious how that was received in the North, whether people saw that as a real opportunity. Finally, we have the government making a commitment, or...
Well, when I came on in 75, they certainly did. Now, Calder was previous to the policy statement. And as I understand the history, first of all, Tom Berger was the lawyer bringing this action forward on behalf of the Nisga'a, an Indian group in BC. And he was arguing, as I recall, he was arguing that native rights existed and native ownership to land existed. I think that was, there was probably a lot more to it than that. But the Supreme Court split on the decision. Some said yes, some said, well, if it ever had been, it had been extinguished through something. And the deciding vote was cast in what is gossiped to be intervention by Pierre Trudeau, saying to this judge, look, if you vote no on this, I commit to making land claim settlements. So this judge chose as the reasoning behind the no vote was that they said Tom Berger failed to ask Lieutenant Governor of BC if he could sue the government. And because he hadn't done that, he had to rule against them. Well, that's about as off topic as it could be. So this was an important issue, I think, for the federal government, because just as in Alaska, they had been facing legal challenge without land claim settlements for their statehood and the pipeline. Canada was facing the same thing in the James Bay development. That in northern Quebec, they were really threatening to sue. As you say, this activism was getting going. Okay, Calder didn't quite make it, but he gave us enough that we could do something. And they were holding up the whole James Bay project. So this policy was important so that they could move forward in James Bay. And that was the first settlement. But what's important to understand about the James Bay negotiation as opposed to ours is that basically all the lead in those negotiations was taken by Hydro-Quebec. Indian Affairs played a very minor, almost observational role. I knew both those people that worked on that on behalf of Indian Affairs. They didn't do anything. They just sat and watched and reported back. Now, Quebec took a little bit more interest in it. So, in looking at the James Bay Agreement with Peter Cumming, when we were starting on our thing, we said, look, they're really weak on the land and the land ownership side. They're really strong on the municipal government, self-government, control over education, all the municipal things. They were really big on those. And I can't remember their cash component. Whereas in the United States, in Alaska, their settlement was really strong on the land quantities and money, but no rights. That was part of the deal in Alaska. No special rights here. No, we'll give you all the good American stuff, land and money, but then you're on your own. So we had sort of the two contrasts, if you like, almost the two extremes to work with. And so we sort of took the best of both in terms of our proposal. But one thing, when I went to visit the Alaskans with Sam, the young fellows always told me, they said, you know, we had the attitude, there's more than one way to skin a cat. And that's absolutely true, because in Alaska, they, of course, had this Prudhoe Bay development looming, and they didn't have any ownership of it, but those clever guys, they went and got through the Alaskan, I think, Rural Municipality Act or something like that, which they could set up a borough. So old Eben Hobson, he got the guys together, and they went and set up the North Slope Borough. And then he taxed the hell out of Prudhoe Bay. So, you know, they got best of everything, if you like, just through their cleverness. And I asked the young fellows, you know, where do you guys learn to do all this stuff anyway? Because they were really worldly, and they were really articulate, and they were really smart. And they said, oh, it's the draft. They said, they take it out of here for 4 years and give us training, education, we see the world, and they come back really worldly people. And so, unlike any negotiations in Canada, their negotiations were a matter of sending young fellows down to lobby the various groups in the Congress. And they got their land claim settlement through lobbying. And they got no government support for this. So the old ladies always had bake sales up in the North Slope, so get enough money to send the guys down. and they were really, I really admired them. I thought they did a great job. So, you know, we learned a lot of lessons out of Alaska, and they were all good lessons. I mean, I think they helped us out.
But you use the term clever, they were clever, but that's something that strikes me the more I learn about the land claim is the result is achieved, but maybe not directly.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so somebody had the end game in mind,
yeah,
and was able to find their way through the process. And
yeah,
the government said, well, you can't do that, move around, find another way to do it.
So that's one thing we should probably spend some more time on some point, is that how the final agreement addressed those two things. Because just in the beginning, I'll say that as a negotiator, you're sometimes tempted to stay with what you call prescriptive solutions, because they take a situation, they tell you exactly what you got to do with it. But I really saw the advantage of what the North Slope people had done, and I would say the alternative to being very prescriptive about something is being enabling. In other words, there's a way here to get it done if you know what the way is. So on one hand, where you're dealing with land and rights, it's absolutely clear. There can be no doubt about how much money you're getting or how much land you're getting. But on all the rest of the things, you've got goals and objectives, but you got all these different means to an end. So what I've always said to the Inuvialuit is, what you can do with this agreement, if you really know the agreement, is that if you've got a problem you can't find an answer directly to in the final agreement, there are probably 4 other ways that the final agreement can help you get there. You just got to know what they are and know how to use them. So anyway.
It's kind of like navigating through the shoals at the mouth of the Mackenzie.
Yes, that's right. Or flying in fog. Yep.
Okay, so,
Can we break for a minute?
sorry, yeah.
They're really good, solid people, you know, that were really behind doing. These are the bureaucrats. There were those who were just trying to take care of themselves and screw you up as every way possible. I'd like to spend some time talking about that because there was one real bad dude in Indian Affairs that causes nothing but grief.
Do you want to go on to that now? The other thing I wanted to go back to, mature choice, talk a little bit more about the land use and occupancy study.
Oh, yes. Okay.
On one hand, we were talking about, you know, the oil and gas putting pressure for getting things done, getting everything resolved. Got the policy statements that are coming out of the federal government, partially in response to what James Bay was negotiating on that, and the Calder case, and other activism that was going on. But you couldn't argue a land claim unless you could demonstrate occupation of the
Yes,
land.
that was a precondition, right in the 73 statement, yeah. And in my view, the Inuit were the only ones that interpreted that correctly. You and I think we're talking about this before, where it was land use and occupancy. It had to be both. And the Inuit interpreted that meaning, where did we live? What lands do we depend on to hunt on? Where did we trap? That's the occupancy part. Because that constitutes your use of the land and where you did it. Where I know the Dene, their land use and occupancy was land use or occupancy. So yeah, they knew where they lived, but if anybody traveled to Herschel Island, you know, to sightsee or do whatever, yeah, that was part of our land use. So they were claiming all kinds of overlap that never was real.
Became a line on the map.
Yeah.
Taking land use map.
Yeah. And a bunch of lines don't constitute occupancy. So I think the Inuit did a very competent job. And Peter Usher was the one that did the Western Arctic. And he just had to modify his work and verified a lot of it to bring it down to the regional scope that we were looking at. And in my opinion, he did a very, very fine job. So.
And how was that project undertaken? Was that before your time?
Well, the Inuit one was, but as I say, based on their experience, we had to do this for the area we were talking about because we had now reduced the scope. And so we had to stay within the territory. We had to justify our territory, if you like. So we had to separate out all the data to deal with strictly the Inuvialuit part of it.
Okay. So when I look at these photographs of the Bergeron quarry, see these land use maps pinned up on the wall, and people are talking to them. Is that the Inuit land use and occupancy study maps?
It could have been either, but my guess is that it's probably ours, our regional ones. Now that's because the Inuvialuit were represented in Bergeron Quarry, and we were talking Beaufort Sea offshore drilling. So that's strictly Inuvialuit territory. So that's my guess. And of course, our land use and occupancy maps extended right over to Alaska. So that's the whole North Slope part. So.
Okay, well let me dwell on that for a minute. This is more for my personal interest. So Milton Friedman was in charge of the land use and occupancy study. There's the 2 or 3 volume set that's been published.
Yes.
So but the regional one is, there's something else in addition to that for the regional study, is that right?
Yes, that's correct. Whether that's been published or not, I'm sure it has been, but I just.
Yeah, I'm curious about that.
Yeah.
No. I always assumed that they were all the same thing and that Inuvialuit simply used that portion. Yeah, okay.
No, but clearly we built on what was done, you know, so we just had to make it absolutely relevant to what we were doing. So that was part of our getting ready. We haven't probably talked about, in setting up this boundary, there was some question about whether Holman Island wanted to be part of Cope or whether they wanted to be part of Nunavut.
Mm-hmm.
And so they took a vote and they decided to go with Cope. I can't tell you why, except that I think Cope provided a really solid timeline. You know, it's going to be right now, get a land claim settlement, and I guess they had confidence in that. At that point, ITC was still adrift, and
Do you know what year that would have been? Was that just before
well,
the-
we put our claim in May 13th, 77. So this is done prior to that because we had to take into all these communities into account. I'm sorry, I just don't have the date. I can find it for you in my little book, wherever it is.
Okay, well, maybe.
At some point, yeah.
We'll talk about. Yeah, that's interesting. I know a number of people have brought that up as a question, Bob, and we've never really been able to get the answer, although, you know, we haven't explored it in detail. The impression that I had is it was a fairly late in the process the decision was made, but you're saying it was made before the agreement of principle.
Maybe
Was it
before the
good?
proposal,
Before the proposal.
yeah.
So
But we didn't take much time preparing that regional proposal, you
it was
know.
done in 2 months, wasn't it?
Yeah,
If I've got the dates right, I think the Nunavut proposal was like,
well,
anyway, I heard it was from May to October somewhere there.
yeah, well, it was 76 that ITC put their proposal in, wasn't it? And so we got ours in 77, May 31st. So between those two dates, we did all that work. So in the same way in land use and occupancy, we did a regional thing. We had Pedro Van Meurs do the geology of the Western Arctic, the oil and gas, and come up with a regional plan. Like, he really hadn't developed a really good approach to oil and gas in the Nunavut claim. For one thing, it wasn't as significant in the overall as minerals. So he did all of that, and I was quite impressed because when we were wanting to do this, he was a petroleum economic geologist with Geological Survey of Canada, and that's when the department was quite small, you know, only 2 or 3 people, something like that, and he handled that whole side of it. But we just took a delegation with Pedro down to see the Geological Survey people, and they said, look, this is what we need. We need all your latest data on oil and gas and minerals. They said, fine, we'll put a team right on it. And they put all their geologists to work. They took all of their maps, everything, and compiled them all for Pedro.
It's remarkable.
Yeah, they were just really being helpful. Well, Pedro was our old buddy, eh? So Pedro was working with really updated material. So we were pretty confident when we put that proposal in that we knew what was where. And Pedro was really a brilliant man. I liked working with him.
So we're jumping ahead a bit here, but with this, one of the main criteria for selecting the 7-1B lands, is that the work that Pedro did?
That was everything. Don't forget, in our proposal, we had proposed, this is on Pedro's advice, a 3% royalty on all oil and gas in the whole Western Arctic region. Okay? The land selection had nothing to do with oil and gas. That was on different things. So economically, what that meant at the thinking at that time is if oil and gas had gone ahead, the Inuvialuit would be like Kuwait. you know, just filthy rich.
Yeah.
And so Indian Affairs couldn't have that. So their rebuttal to what the government was saying, government said, no, you can't have that. We're going to cap it at $45 million. So yeah, you can take all the risks on the royalties, but you're only going to get $45 million. Well, we said, screw that. Why take all the risk and have no upside, you know? So that's when things modified in the proposal to go for the $45 million cash compensation. We went for ownership of oil and gas on community lands, so that's 700 square miles of a community, and then all the rest of the land quantum in what we call the B lands, which is you take oil and gas out, but everything else stays in. So that's why it's a B land. It's not a surface title. It's everything but oil and gas. So I would suggest you look to, well, what are the advantages of that? Well, you get your $45 million, you get the upside potential of your ownership of oil and gas and minerals, and you get control through the participation agreements and your hunting rights over all the rest of the land. So we're tying other things to land ownership. If you look at the exclusive rights, they go to all Inuvialuit land. So I would couple that with looking at where the land selections were. If you look at those maps, the land selections go all the way from the Yukon border, all the way through to Nunavut. The whole coastline, there's nobody can wheel in and out of there without crossing Inuvialuit land. So you have to look at the strength of participation agreement, the linking of rights to those areas and what those rights mean, and you'll see the significance of that. Now, we got, what, 35,000 square miles of land in the final agreement? Well, at the agreement in principle, we had more than that. But we hadn't done the land selection at the agreement in principle. We only had the community land. So then we got into the whole, after the agreement in principle, we got into the whole land selection. And we picked all the land that everybody wanted. We had the whole thing done. And we ran into a bit of a impasse with Simon on some points. So I had to write up a paper of gives and takes in the negotiations to get this thing done. And so we gave him back 3,000 square miles of land. We had too much. So I may be criticized for that, but you look around and where are you going to take another 3,000 square miles of land? I don't know. But all the negotiators were happy. We got everything we want. Well, there were some exceptions, you know, but we weren't going to get those. It was just more land quantum. So
I just want to ask for clarification. So the $45 million, is that based on oil and gas and mineral
well,
resources?
it came out as a direct result, as I was trying to explain, of the government wanting to cap our royalties at 45 million. So they came up with that number. And then Pedro, he looked at that and he says, not too bad if we do this trade-off. That's not too bad. And then that clever little Dutchman, he figured out a way to make that 45 million a lot more. But yeah, that was Pedro. Yeah, well, he delayed payments, like they were going to pay in installments. He said, that's fine, you pay us interest and inflation. So that added another 8%. So, so that meant, because we're being paid over time, we're getting a lot more. And then he had this clever little trick in there about, you know, you can borrow against future transfers and pay it back through when the transfer is supposed to come. So when interest rates are really high, he borrowed all the rest of the financial compensation, paid 8%, And, you know, we pocketed the other 10%. He was a clever little economist. He really was. So, where are we at here now?
Well, we're moving here and there.
Yeah, we're bouncing around a bit, but that's the story, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
Trouble with the Irishman, you get them talking, you won't shut up.
Well, Bob, I know that, yeah, so these agreements were reached, but I know there must have been a process here too as well. When I look in the archive, Cope's archive of materials, I see a lot of joint position papers,
Mm-hmm.
which makes sense. I mean, you put forward a position, the other side puts forward a position, you negotiate and finally come up with an agreement.
Mm-hmm.
Now, so these joint you had, tell me how that worked. So you had to identify a number of issues to reach agreement on. How did you, I mean, can you take an example of a joint position paper and just let us know how you moved through the process?
Well, the most important joint position paper is the one that's referred to as the joint position paper. There were other little smaller ones, but I got to go back into the history a little bit, because after we put the proposal in and went through what we call a clarification process, where the federal government gave us their view of what was on and what was off, and that's when we were adjusting things.
And the proposal is Inuvialuit New.
Yes.
We're talking.
Yeah. So you will find in the archives the modified proposal. And those are the ones that, after preliminary clarification, we adjusted things, like just what we were talking about, the land ownership, the regime situation. And then we got into a spot where the federal government was set to give us a comprehensive response to this modified proposal. And they did this, and it was just terrible. Oh, just awful. They weren't going to do anything different than they'd always done. So we said, no thanks, but no thanks. And based on Peter Cummings' advice, he said, well, I think we should prepare for litigation on this. So we did. We hired Lang Mitchner, and they got a very good litigation firm to prepare a case. So they took about a month to put that together. And by that time, the minister was Faulkner, J. Hugh Faulkner. And we got a meeting with him and his senior staff, and we said, look, this is serious. We can't deal with what you proposed here, so we're going to sue you. And Lang Mitchner was there, and they said, yeah, we're going to beat you too. He's a real tough little cookie. So that sent them into a bit of a tailspin, them being the federal government, Indian Affairs. And Faulkner said, look, just hang on. Let's just, before you jump into this, let's just see if we can work something out. So he put his deputy minister, Arthur Kruger, who was a very, very fine man, and his hand-picked negotiator that was, we just looked at his picture. I've lost it. Anyway, yeah, we'll get his name. Really, really fine man. He was the negotiator to the agreement in principle. He says, you just, see what you can work out. And that's when the joint position paper was developed. So it was totally without prejudice situation. Said, let's just see what we can agree on here. Let's take a couple of the contentious issues. Let's just sketch them out. Just to give both sides the confidence we could move to an agreement. Because I think the Liberal government, this was Pierre Elliott Trudeau's Liberal government, was very anxious to get a settlement. One, they wanted to clear things up for the Beaufort Sea, and two, they wanted to demonstrate real progress on this file of land claim settlements. So that's what we did. We sat down with this federal negotiator, and it was mostly Peter Cumming, Pedro, and myself. And we worked these joint position out. And it really was a pretty good, I mean, it's better than most agreement in principle of other land claim settlements, but still wasn't fleshed out to the degree we wanted. But we said, now we're in the right direction. So anyway, Indian Affairs, I believe this history's right. Indian Affairs decided they didn't like this threat of it being sued. And I don't blame them, but they said, we can't fund you for land claims if you're going to sue us. So we're going to cut that off. So I understood that. That sort of hit the newspapers, and even Hobson from the North Slope phoned us up and said, hey Sam, want some money? I've arranged $1 million here out of our business corporation. Come on over and we'll have a big ceremony and we'll give you $1 million check. So that's when Sam and I went over. So, I have many fond memories of that trip. One was that was my first exposure to bowhead whale muktuk. And I had the stink muktuk. Oh boy, that was good stuff. I just loved that. And it was kind of funny because I think it was a common joke. You take the white guy and you give him a little muktuk and, you know, watch him throw up or something. So I'm up there in the North Slope office and they're feeding me this stink muktuk. Oh God, it was just like licorice. It was fantastic. I just kept eating it and eating it and eating it. Pretty soon there were a whole bunch of little innocs around their eyes getting bigger and bigger, watching this white guy eat muktuk. So, oh boy, that was good food. So we got that $1 million check. It made big splash in the newspapers. And I gather after we got back, it threw Arthur Kruger and Indian Affairs for a total tailspin. All of a sudden, the threat of funding being cut off. Hey, that didn't matter. They got these rich cousins over there going to pay for the whole thing. So Arthur finally relented and said, okay, well, better get back to negotiating. So we did, and we plowed it through to agreement in principle. And that was a long, hard slug. It didn't take that long, but we really were moving fast in that. And a lot of very detailed work, lots to be left for the final agreement, but we nailed down a lot of the really important things. And we were coming to the end of Trudeau's mandate. There was an election coming up, so we knew we had to cut this off at some point. So there was a strategic decision made about where to stop this. But we knew once we stopped it and there was an election, things might not start again for a while. And we didn't know what was going to happen in the election. So we did two things by way of incentive. We got an advance of $9.6 million as part of the signing of the agreement in principle to start up our IDC. We said, well, if we're going to sit here twiddling our thumbs, let's get going on our IDC. And the other was we started the Game Council. There was no such thing as Game Council. There was no regional organization in dealing with wildlife. So Andy came in as the first chairman, and that was, we incorporated under Societies Act of the NWT. And so we got both those things up and running. So we had lots to do if they were going to try to stall.
And Andy is Andy Carpenter.
Andy Carpenter, yes. Yeah, and he was a very, very fine man and a really good leader. And both those things worked out well. I mean, they got things going on them.
And you're saying because you took those steps, they continued to be a priority after the election.
Yeah,
Keeping things
yeah, and we knew things could change a bit, but that gave us a start, gave us a grounding. Nothing else happened. Well, we had an IDC and a game council, so.
So IDC got 9.6 million. What did they use that for? What was IDC's role back then?
Well, just as it was to be after the final agreement. I mean, they were the generators of economic development and make investments and get businesses going. And we got Peter Kulikin in as our first executive director, and he was very, very good, and he did a good job. So I was sorry to see Peter leave. He left before the final agreement, and they never got as good a one in my term there. But and in hindsight, that was a really good suggestion, because the election resulted in the election of the Conservatives and a complete halt to land claims negotiations. And to trace through how that happened was, we got the agreement in principle before the election. The Yukon went absolutely ballistic about this agreement in principle, how it dealt with the North Slope. And they vowed to fight it. They had literature you'd pick up at the airport, and it was put in everybody's mailbox talking about, you know, how terrible this was for the Yukon. It was the most racist, publication. I've got it here if you want to have a look at it. It was just awful. And I mean, they were basically a racist organization. I mean, it was hidden, but it was there. And unfortunately, Eric Nielsen, the Conservatives got in, and Eric Nielsen was elected from that Old Crow riding. And he was the most senior man in cabinet, and he had to reflect the wishes of the Yukon government. So he was vehemently opposed to it. So, who was the minister, the Conservative minister who came in? He was a high school teacher out of Alberta. I'll think of his name. Anyway, he was a pompous ass. And he just decided, well, that's just an agreement in principle. We don't have to pay attention to that. And that fostered all of the anti-land claim bureaucrats in Indian Affairs, the worst of whom was Neil Faulkner, who became the head of Office of Native Claims and then Assistant Deputy Minister. And he set about, during that period of time when the Conservatives weren't going to negotiate, they were just going to kill everything, he set about to put things in place to try to screw us. And he set up this land claim policy in all fairness. Now, if you read that, that's directed at a whole bunch of things we got in our agreement that he didn't like. For example, through Pedro's cleverness, we got this whole concept in terms of land access for development in this consent agreement at that point in time, but it became participation agreement, in which developer had to get your consent before they had access to the subsurface resources that they owned. Totally unlike Alberta, where they have the we go in, develop our oil and gas, and we'll deal with compensation later or whatever. But we got a right to just cut your fences and go in. But Pedro says, no way, you stay home until you come to this agreement. Well, that just drove him absolutely crazy. So he drafted a bill which came to our attention through, I think, the deputy minister. It was called the Northern Right of Entry Act, which just mirrors the Alberta government's oil and gas legislation. We go in, we do what we want, pay you off later. Well, of course, we had a lot more than just payoff in terms of the concept of the consent agreement. We had the whole notion of participation, like we want to be part of this if you're coming in. So that's one example. Then another example that comes to mind is he negotiated a new memorandum of understanding with the Yukon government. Now, he didn't quite give them third-party status, which they were seeking, like independent status, but he gave them really a lot of influence to send negotiators, and because he knew Yukon was going to be against this. And the third thing was we'd had this special relationship with our negotiator to the agreement in principle. He was linked in directly to the deputy minister, who was the most senior deputy minister in the cabinet. So basically, he had the ability to make decisions. Like he could go against the department, like the Neil Faulkners. He could say, "No, this is what we're going to do, and this is why." And so you had real confidence when you were in the negotiations. You could work through things. Like, okay, we'll give a bit, you give a bit, and whatever. We come to an understanding, and it's going to happen. So what he did was he said, this isn't going to work. We can't have these independent people running around telling us what to do. So he installed a bureaucratic negotiator, Mary Gazella. And she was part of this program, as far as I could see, this affirmative action program that Indian Affairs is going through, where they put women in senior positions. And she was one of those up-and-comers. And she was lazy as a pet coon, and absolutely no initiative at all. Absolutely none. I mean, she couldn't decide the time of day, or she couldn't decide anything. So she was just in there to stall everything. So we raised a big fuss about that when the Conservatives got out. And the Liberals came back in, and we made the pitch to Monroe, I guess who was the minister right off the bat, that, look, we need an independent negotiator. We need somebody that reports directly to you, that can make decisions. And and he thought it was a good idea. He had no problem with that. But this Arthur Kruger I was telling you about, he'd moved on to another department. I think he went to the Department of Transportation. And this young up-and-comer, Paul Tellier, came in as the deputy minister. And he was very aggressive. And I didn't get along with him at all. And so when we made this pitch to go for an independent negotiator, he really wasn't for it all that much. But he had to go along with it. And we got Monroe quite, I think, sort of in a good way, put 2 or 3 names forward. And I didn't know any of them. But anyway, I hummed and hawed, and finally all the other, like the ITC and Yukon, I think it was Yukon. Anyway, there were 3 names there. So the only one left was the senator, whose name happened to be Davy Stewart. And his background was he was finance minister in Ross Thatcher's Liberal government there. Heck of a nice guy. But he was 80-something years old. He was in the Senate. I guess Monroe thought, gee, this would really be neat. Have a senator doing this, you know, gives it a little bit of credibility. Anyway, after Davey had been on for a little while, Monroe had to come to him and say, hey, sorry, Davey, I can't pay you for this. It's against some rule. Like, he's in the Senate, he can't take a job with the government, make more money. Well, Davey said, oh, that's okay, but he was pretty burned about that. So he sort of lost interest. And it was on Christmas Eve, he got the minister to sign a letter to us saying, well, in order to go to a final agreement, we got to do away with the North Slope, get rid of wildlife compensation, and something else that Indian Affairs didn't like. So we said, thanks, but no thanks. Screw it. We'll meet with you. But so anyway, we went into this meeting with Monroe and Tellier and all the big poobahs. And Tellier and I got into a fight like you wouldn't believe. And he was such a bully. And he just didn't know what he was talking about. He was a politician, basically. And he starts yelling at me. He's right beside me. He said, are you calling me a hassle? I said, no, if I wanted to do that, I'd call you an asshole. So he hated my guts. But, oh, he was such a bad man. So, anyway, Monroe finally decided after we were not negotiating for a few months, better find a new negotiator. So we put out feelers for who might be good. Yeah, they got a list of 8 names. I saw the list later, but they were really good people. I mean, and one of them was our friend Simon, who was the retired Deputy Minister of Finance, very senior guy, very well respected by cabinet. And so they didn't ask us. He went through the whole vetting process. Simon told me this afterwards. So they wanted to know if he wanted this job, and he said, yeah, I guess so. And so they were briefing Simon. Simon told me this after about a month. They were briefing him about what it was like to work with Cope and the negotiators and all that thing. And I guess Tellier told him a lot of really not nice things about me. So Simon, I met with Simon, and you know, Simon's got a really bad reputation for being a rough negotiator. So they picked Simon. So we had to sit down and say, look, are we going to go for this or not? And I said, yeah, I think we better. Maybe tough, but at least you know if you get something with him, you've got it. So, he spent the first month really roughing me up. But anyway, he said, Bob, come over, I want to talk to you. He said, when I was looking to get this job, I was given a briefing by Indian Affairs. And he says, I don't know what you did, but they think you're the Antichrist. I said, well, that's the biggest compliment they could have paid me. So anyway, after this month or so, of sort of a break-in period, when Simon realized it wasn't going to get too far with that tactic, then we started making some progress. But what Simon didn't count on was the fact that he was a very typical Jewish negotiator. And I don't say that from a racist point of view, but I had the advantage of growing up in Toronto in a Jewish neighborhood on a whole bunch of successful Jewish businessmen. And, well, for example, in my junior high, there was 800 students in there, and there were only 2 of us that weren't Jewish. We were both Gentiles. So I I knew where he was coming from right from the beginning. His little tactics wouldn't work on me. But in fairness to Simon, after he got to know the Inuvialuit and saw the, what we were doing and why we were doing it, he really came on board. And he was a real advocate. And he proposed a lot of things. And it was really good.
I mentioned that I've seen in the archives some of the briefing notes that were prepared for him, probably in the early days after he took on the role of chief negotiator for the federal government. And some very good marginal comments that he made on it. As I read through that document, I wondered, though, what does he really know about the North? Had Simon Reisman even been to the North?
No.
Or was he just approaching it as a skilled bureaucrat?
Yeah, that's what he was. Sold himself on the basis that he was smart, he was tough, and he had the confidence of Trudeau and the cabinet. But there's a lot of history in there we can fill in, but I remember the day he went to cabinet, we were real buddy by that time, eh? So he says, well, I got to go over and brief cabinet now. I said, come on with me. So we go jump in his big Buick that was about the size of a small steamship. Drive over, park there. I'm waiting for him. He was in there about an hour and a half. And he comes out smoking his big cigar and he says, Bob, I was spectacular. And in the meantime, somebody had parked too close to him in the front, so he just sits in this great big Buick. He wasn't a big man, but he sits in this Buick, backs up, smashes into the car behind him, goes forward, smashes into the car there, gets enough room to drive out. So that tells you a little bit about how he goes about things, just death and destruction.
Get out of my way. But as he got into it, though, you say he warmed to the new.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
He began to respect, as he understood the goals and what people, probably what they'd gone through in the past, I guess, and what they're trying to achieve in the future. Did he travel around the ISR? Did he go into?
Yeah, we took him up on one trip. He got over to Herschel Island, got to all the communities, and he misbehaved in Inuvik, but...
Well, we won't get into that.
No, he was good. I mean, first of all, he saw the Inuvialuit were really sensible, pragmatic. They weren't putting a lot of things forward that were just smoke and mirrors. He got to like the team, and he and Nellie had a few fisticuffs, so he really respected Nellie. And no, it was a very respectful relationship. And we'll come back to this at some point, but if you compare the Inuvialuit Final Agreement with any other land claim settlement, a few things jump out at you. One is it's the shortest. It's only 65 pages long. It's written in plain English. And there are reasons for all of that. But part of the reason is it wasn't written by lawyers. I wrote it.
You wrote it.
Yeah. And I'm not saying all by myself, but I have a particular style of writing, and Peter Cumming and I got along fine with it. We liked plain language, and it was meant to be understood by people who were non-lawyers, but if they knew the subject matter, they could understand it. Another reason for that, if you read the other agreements, it's all written by lawyers. And in hindsight, I get the feeling that it's written by people who don't fundamentally agree. Like they're disagreeing, so they're creating all this uncertainty by all these. Like you take anything in the Yukon Agreement, and you have to go back through 15 references back. So you have to track all this stuff forward, and there's so much room for misunderstanding, misinterpretation, but it's the perfect platform for lawyers to sue. Like this is just a goldmine for lawyers, where we made sure, because of the arbitration process, lawyers and courts weren't involved, got an expeditious ruling, and it's going to be fair.
So I had assumed that, you know, you and Simon would agree, you know, your teams would get together and hash things out and come to a general agreement on something, then turn it over to a legislative or legal drafts person to, what's it like that?
No. 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 He had his lawyers, we had ours, Michael, and we got him going into the final agreement because Peter Cumming had quit after the agreement in principle. But no, this is the confidence Simon had in us. We'd come to an agreement, and he'd say, Bob, you go write it up. Bring it to us tomorrow. So we did. So when you have the initiative of writing it, I can sneak lots of stuff in there. and so, yeah, it worked out well. And Simon had very good legal counsel. Very good. Very fine man, who was also very supportive of Inuvialuit. And he was smart, he understood it, he was sympathetic. And so it was a good combination. But on just about anything wildlife, like you take wildlife compensation or you take the hunting rights or whatnot, Simon didn't want anything to do with that. So at the agreement in principle stage, wildlife compensation was one sentence. Nobody knew what it meant. I didn't know what it meant. It was just an idea that was out there. So there were no models to go for. So he says, well, I know the minister doesn't want to have wildlife compensation, but Bob, you go away and write something. So that took me about a week. So that's what's in the final agreement. Same with the hunting rights. You propose something to make you happy and it pass muster with his crew. Yeah, go for it.
But it had to align, of course, with the comprehensive land claims policy. Not because reading over that 1973 statement, it says something to the effect that it have exclusive rights to wildlife harvesting in, well, in this case, in Inuvialuit lands, but only preferential on crown lands. Did you follow those kinds of parameters, or?
Yeah, to a certain extent.
Yeah.
First of all, we got exclusive right to species, and that was based on somewhat historical precedent. In this sense, what was really important as an exclusive species was polar bear. Now, the IUCN agreement on polar bears that was done years before our negotiations said only native people should hunt these. In other words, they were trying to get at the sports hunt or the Alaskans, because basically anybody could jump in their super cub and go out and shoot a polar bear. So they wanted to cut that right out. So they had an exclusive right to polar bear, and of course we wanted to protect that. Then we added muskox to that on the basis that nobody else hunts muskox anyway, because the argument for preferential right is you've got a whole bunch of non-Inuvialuit there competing for the same animals. Yeah, well, okay, they didn't compete with anyone on polar bear. That was exclusive to them already, and same with muskox. Nobody was really interested in muskox. The big ones were caribou. Now, it's important for people to understand that we define preferential right in a very special way that nobody else does. How we define it is, number one, you establish the population numbers and how many you can harvest. Then you see what the Inuvialuit need, and they get that cut. if there aren't enough animals to go around, preferential for the Inuvialuit becomes exclusive. Nobody else has that. Everybody else's preferential right is, let's say, this group of Aboriginal people take 10% of the total harvest. So when populations start going down, they still get 10% of what's allowed. So it never becomes meeting your needs in a situation of shortage. It becomes a matter of sharing in some historical way. So, and to cover off some of the difficulty we had with that preferential, because you always got to contemplate, too much pressure on these populations can cause real problems. We got the exclusive right to all Inuvialuit land. So you look at all the lands that are Inuvialuit and look at where the Inuvialuit harvest, they've got exclusive rights on everything where they harvest. It's just not on the total population. So you take a migrating caribou population, of course, you have the exclusive right when they get on your land, but they may not get there. so yeah. And another sort of groundbreaking thing that people don't realize is that we got into the agreement, or the final agreement, our domestic caribou agreement that we drafted after Berger. And there was an obligation in the final agreement for Canada to take that and turn it into an international obligation. And they did that. So we basically drafted the international agreement. And it's quite forward thinking. I mean, there's...
So is that the porcupine caribou?
Yeah, and you look in our annex and there's our, that's the draft. Yeah. And how that came about was going back to Berger. Of course, there was a lot of concern about porcupine caribou. Yeah. And porcupine caribou are shared between the Inuvialuit, the Gwich'in, and I think 2 or 3 other communities, something like that. So in Berger got this caribou biologist in his expert witness, Val Geist, who was a graduate from UBC. He was a year or 2 ahead of me. And
University of Calgary at the time too.
Is that right? You knew Val?
I did.
Yeah.
Yes.
Brilliant man, eh?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and what a fun man to work with. So I said, Val, we got an opportunity here to get an agreement in Canada and maybe even an international agreement, because he'd proposed that to Berger, and I liked it. I said, yeah, that's a good idea. So he and I sat down. He was the head of environmental design, I think, at that point. Yes. He and I sat down and we hammered out this draft agreement. And I peddled it around to Old Crow, Jim Burke, Métis Association, a few other people. Anyway, we got everybody in Canada to sign on. And then, because Simon didn't know any better, I said, I want that in the final agreement. So he said, fine. So
well, it does stand out. I mean, it's good that it's there. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So that's how that came about. And it's a good agreement. I mean, in so many aspects of that international agreement are unprecedented. And interestingly, it sort of became a model that Norm Snow and Andy Carpenter took later in doing the polar bear agreement. So they flew off to do this agreement with the North Slope. And they took Ian Sterling, a polar bear biologist, with them, who was a real supporter of getting this international agreement going. And they brought back a draft when I had found out about it, and I looked at it and I just about choked. I had no problem with what they were trying to get at and what the substance was, but it was just drafted in such a terrible way. it didn't use the final agreement. It just got in the way of it all the time. You know, it was stuff that was unenforceable and some of it. I said, look,
So this is after the IFA is in place.
Yeah,
Negotiating this international agreement.
yeah. And Norm wanted to do this on his own. I don't know why. Could have asked me. But anyway, I was at this meeting with the game council and I said, you know, I like what you guys are trying to do, but this really needs some tidying up. So he said, oh, yeah, go rewrite it. So I rewrote it for him. And it was quite a nice little document. And I think it served them well. So that's good. Well,
Take 5 again?
yeah, take 5 again.
Okay, we thought we'd just go a little bit longer, Bob, and maybe pick up again tomorrow.
Sure. Oop,
Although I know that.
I hit your mic here, unfortunately.
Okay. I'll probably drill down into some more detail tomorrow. We're getting some really good stuff on just a broad overview and attitudes with a little bit of detail in here, of course. And I'm learning a lot. I mean, I'm hearing things that are filling in a lot of gaps in my understanding.
Yeah. And it's hard to do this from reading about it. You know, you read the history and it doesn't really give you the details or nuances or the circumstances quite as much as,
Yeah.
Or your personality.
well, probably better they don't know.
Yeah.
So one thing I just noticed here, you say position title. I was the implementation coordinator.
Thank you. That's what I thought. I wanted
Yeah.
to confirm that.
Yeah. And the other important thing in connection with that is that I was getting so frustrated with Indian Affairs during the implementation process because, as I say, they were just trying to ignore this whole thing and business as usual, you know. And so that deputy minister was Jacques Girard, that I knew from the Department of Environment. And he and I were quite good friends. So, I mean, not personal friends, but we certainly had a lot of respect for each other. And old Jacques has me into his office, and he was part of the coordinating committee to try to get things going between Indian Affairs and it. So he said, well, is there anything I can do for you today? And I said, yeah, we've been having a real hard time with the Department of Agriculture on this muskox inspection. Because we'd go and see them and they'd, you know, we can't really do it because we can't do wild animals. And I said, well, you do reindeer. Well, they're not really wild animals. And, you know, what we require is you build a slaughterhouse and heat it, and then you have all these health controls they can put in place because they're dealing with a warm environment. And I wanted to set up our slaughterhouse on the ice, absolutely sterile, and just heat it enough to keep the guys comfortable, you know. No, I really didn't like this. So anyway, we said, well, Jacques, you can help me out with the Department of Agriculture to get meat inspected. Oh, sure. I said, wait a minute, picks up the phone, calls Deputy Minister, Department of Agriculture. He said, hey, we got a problem here. A month later, the act gets changed. That's how fast those guys can move if they want to, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so we were able to supply all the muskox and caribou to the NWT pavilion for Expo.
Very good.
Geez, we made a fortune on that. First time it was inspected, and
Well, this was the hunt on Banks Island.
yeah, yeah. I forget how many animals we processed. I think it was about 300.
Yeah, I heard 280 was one
Yeah.
of them. I knew Patrick Schmidt, probably after your time, and he worked for IRC and probably an economic development officer. And he was, one of his portfolios was to manage and do the paperwork around a couple of those hunts.
Oh, yeah.
In the 90s, early 2000s, I guess.
So that was right before the demise of the whole thing, eh?
Not really sure. Yeah, that's right. It was. I think he was there during the demise, and I think they had one year where the weather just wasn't cooperating. But
That could be.
factors involved in that too.
But one of the advantages we had for Expo is we got a really good meat inspector out of Alberta, who was their veterinarian. He wasn't really their meat inspection guy. And so I said, well, this is what we'd like to do. Take these muskox and we'd like to cut them up, debone them. Yeah, he said, fine. So he, he inspected what we had there. He said, fine, go ahead. So we deboned everything. So everything that was shipped out was just pure product.
Mm.
And, you're flying Twin Otter out of there, so that makes quite a difference. Anyway, agriculture found out about it. He phoned me up and he says, sorry, I shouldn't have let you do that. Because apparently there's a whole other set of regulations for processing facilities. You got slaughterhouses one side, then you got this other thing. Well, I was never going to get certification for that. So after that, it became less lucrative.
Oh, okay.
But the other thing is that Peter Van Meurs, for all of his strengths, figured that he could take that over, that whole renewable resource project concept. And unfortunately, he really didn't understand what was involved. And he got $10 million to do that. And he just blew it in the worst ways. He was getting chefs down, and he set up an office in Calgary. Chefs and all kinds of stuff, and bought all kinds of equipment. And then he came to me one day, he says, this is never going to work because there's got too much bone in it. I said, I don't know what you're talking about, but I've seen the test cutting results. They take a few animals and they cut them down, they weigh everything, and you see how the animal breaks down. They're pretty close to cattle, It's not that bad. Anyway, they decided to call it quits, wrote off $10 million. I never spent a cent of Inuvialuit money on mine. I took all the GNWT's money to do it.
So you're the implementation coordinator. Was that from day one after the
Yeah.
IFA? Okay. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Now, I know if you look on the website, it's not Indian Affairs anymore, Development, whatever it is, Aboriginal Affairs. They lay out a process for, here's how to negotiate your land claim, and right, probably 7 out of 8 steps is implementation plan.
Yeah.
There's no Inuvialuit, no IFA implementation.
That came after ours, because basically it was just total chaos on the federal side. And so I negotiated most of that implementation funding. We got the Joint Secretariat up and running. That isn't in the final agreement. Joint Secretariat was set about, because Liz Snyder and I sat down with their implementation person, and the final agreement required the government to provide review board, screening committee, and something else with, support services. And we said, look, if this is going to work together, because all these pieces have to fit together, they're not independent committees or anything, they all have to work together. We should have one resource center that served everybody. And so they agreed to it, and we set up the Joint Secretariat.
Mm.
So, and I was the guy responsible for hiring Norm Snow on. I knew him for a long time. And I had no idea what a mistake that would be. But he did some good too, but he was not a fan of people learning the final agreement. Like, he thought he knew enough about it that if nobody else knew anything about it, then you sort of in good stead. And I saw too much of that. But
So was that Joint Secretary, did it come into play right away, or was that a while?
Very soon. Yeah.
Okay.
See, in the implementation part, we had to get the IRC up and running. The Game Council was already there. IDC was already there. We had to get community corporations up and running. We had to get an investment corporation going. And so as an interim basis on IRC, we brought in Billy Day to be sort of the head of that for a period of time, till we could have elections. You know, we had to get all the bylaws set up. Boy, there was a lot of work. But one of the interesting things we should talk about is, on the wildlife side, is you talk to anybody up there and you ask about the management system there, and it's all co-management. Well, the final agreement doesn't mention co-management at all.
I think there's joint.
It's joint.
Joint management.
And I think, I've talked to a lot of people about it, I think they should go back to joint. And here's why. There's absolutely no consensus on what co-management means. It runs the whole spectrum from do it together to co-opting people. Now the history is quite different and quite significant, because we picked joint using the UN model. When the UN goes into a sovereign country to help out, they do it through a joint secretariat, and that's a recognition of your sovereignty. So nobody's the boss there, but it's real, you're going to work out this problem together. Co-management came through fisheries, and it was an attempt on their part to give a better spin to the way they usually did management, like decide in Ottawa and tell everybody what to do. Like this is a chance you'd consult people and things like that. And the only reason I can think of that they went from joint management to co-management and pushed it so hard is that federal fisheries had a whole bunch of money to throw at that. And for Norm, money was everything. Money was power, money was ability to do more, you know, so that's my suspicion. I don't know that 100%, but I keep telling him it's not co-management, it's joint management. So anyway.
But it's still called the fisheries joint management.
Yeah. But when they talk about it, you know.
Yeah, and I know I've heard the question several times phrased in different ways, that if you're, say, government rep on a co-management committee, whose interests are you there to represent? The organization that pays your bills, in case it must be the government, or the joint management committee, which is there to solve a problem, deal with an issue, come up with a policy, whatever, that to meet the needs of the IFA. And so that tensions and perhaps some uncertainty seems to still be.
Oh, totally, totally. But, you know, to me it's such a funny question in the sense that bureaucrats are used to working under acts and regulations. They're also used to act on behalf of their departments. And they think that's one and both. But they're not. Legally, their job is there under the final agreement. No question about that. Who they represent, why they're appointed, you're there to bring knowledge, experience, expertise from your government's perspective to the problem. And then the joint group is supposed to figure out a solution that addresses everybody's concerns, if you like, or gets the problem solved. And they're not doing that. I think Vic Gilman probably comes pretty close. I think Lindsay's group probably comes pretty close. But yeah, it's a funny question. I get it a lot.
Yeah, maybe. I think people have come to the realization the way you've explained it. But yeah, it does seem to come up again and again, doesn't it? But people have to be reminded about that. And in practice, you know, maybe the loyalty is to the organization pays your check.
Yeah.
Anyways.
Well, it creates a dilemma for the representative where you're representing a government that, like the Yukon, that's just totally out to lunch on what the final agreement means. So that makes it more difficult. But quite frankly, that's part of the problem about not training people that are sitting on these committees. Like, they have no idea why they're there. They have no idea what the mandate is. They think just they've been picked either because they're really good or smart, or they need a job, or whatever the reason. Nobody's given the job, what the job is.
And I think that's one of the tools that IRC wants to deal with right now. So on the one hand, this IFA 101 program is to create a high level awareness for people who are working for IRC, and maybe entry into some of these topics as well for the general public. But to be a foundation for building on the more detailed, more specialized knowledge of roles, responsibilities, procedures, implementation. So that piece, I think, will be developed, and they begin doing that already with this it's an orientation manual they're developing for the Joint Secretariat.
Well, that's good.
What do they call it? Section 11 to 14 folks. There's some jargon and terminology that's developed here, and that's where you know something has become part of the culture, when there's jargon that everybody begins to understand.
I really told, what's his name, Mike up there, I said, when he was doing this thing for the section 11 to 14 people, don't talk about surface title. I said, that's a mistake. Oh, he says, well, that's how everybody refers to it. I said, I don't care. That's why they're wrong. Once you say 71B land and you know what that is, then you always know what it is you're talking about. And I think the same thing for joint, but that's just my opinion.
I want to just go back and get your take on something. So you mentioned that before the IFA was in place, IDC was set up, and the Game Council was set up.
Yes.
So on the one hand, you've got IDC, which is, and I think as IRC was put in place as well, they kind of subsumed all these responsibilities. It really is development. So you've got development on one hand. Game Council, on the other hand, is to preserve the wildlife so that there's an ongoing. So you've got development, you've got conservation. Was it always intended to have the two organizations perhaps having those
competing roles?
Competing roles, and somehow finding balance. Is that?
That came about through several things. One is that one of the problems with Indian Affairs is they had internally those conflicts, and they'd never be resolved satisfactorily. So the way I looked at it is, look, the Inuvialuit are a relatively small population of people. What you want to get in your leadership roles are part of that top 2%. And they're specialists. Andy Carpenter, don't put him in charge of oil and gas development. Not that he couldn't do it, but use his talents where they're really needed, and that's on the wildlife environment side. The same in the IRC side. But if you tried to have one organization that had the breadth of knowledge they need to do all those things internally, it wouldn't happen. Wouldn't happen. And a perfect example is Roger Gubin. I mean, when he set about to be the wheeler dealer up there with the oil companies, he said, you do a deal with us and I'll make sure you get through screening and review. Boy, I found out about that, and did I ever set him straight. I mean, what a presumptuous, ignorant thing to say. He wouldn't get it through. He couldn't guarantee anything. He just thought he could buy people off or do whatever it took. But it's also beating his own chest that he's, the big, the big dictator that can have anything happen. But anyway.
So you have a guy like Andy Carpenter whose knowledge comes from his experience on the land, the information he learned probably from Fred and others in his family, a capable family, and then the development side. But in the agreement, there's a research advisory council. Is that what it's called? Was that to fill in the gaps of information, and why
Well,
was that never implemented? It was never, it never.
it sort of got undeveloped in the final agreement. And it's just, we simply ran out of time. And it wasn't a big priority at that point in time. But what I saw was there was an awful lot of research coming up into the, mainly on the wildlife environment side of things. It was all uncoordinated. There was no priority attached to it. So whoever got a grant to do whatever it was, they'd come and do it. Well, that doesn't help the Inuvialuit. They've got real problems they'd like to have solved. They want, if there's research money, hey, put it here first, and then we can go do your, you know, count the hairs on a caribou if you want. But now, the Research Advisory Council, I was trying to take the model of the old Fisheries Research Board that was quite a unique organization. And I don't know whether you know the history of the Research Board, but it was established by Act of Parliament in 1912. And it was to operate independently of government. And their job was to research the important fisheries questions. They were given a separate budget. They ran it themselves. They had their own governance body. It was their board. And they'd pull in relevant scientists from all around. Ian McTaggart-Cowan was on there for one aspect of it. My dad was at the same time because he was a statistician on the fishery side of things. And they had huge budgets, and they did great work. They were put right up on the, you know, right on the world stage. There was no better fishery research anywhere in the world than we had. And after the Second World War, Canada entered into a salmon treaty with Japan, in which Canada got most of the salmon. Well, Japan didn't like that very much. So the treaty was to come up for review every so many years, whatever. But anyway, my dad had to attend that meeting in Japan on the renewal of that, and it was only because of the data and research and knowledge that the Fisheries Research Board had been able to gather on Pacific salmon that they were able to maintain it. So they were really, really good. And then just before I went to work with fisheries, in the bureaucrats' wisdom, they decided to do away with Fisheries Research Board and amalgamate the Fisheries Department with the Research Board. So fisheries did very little research. It was the research board that did, so they ruled the roost, if you like. And the fisheries department was mostly fisheries officers and legislators that would draft quotas and whatnot, but research board did all the work for that. So there was always a lot of tension between the two groups. And when they did away with the research board and amalgamated, what they did was there had to be equal numbers of managers from each area. So basically the one I worked for, we got a fisheries officer out of the Yukon who didn't understand anything about research. Matter of fact, he had a certain amount of disdain for the whole concept of research. You don't really need to do that stuff. And so that's what I was telling you. They were really surprised when I found out that I actually had data. You know, holy smoke, what are you doing up there, you renegade? So, so they really suffered for it, you know. So the concept I had in here was that this might be even an independently funded research program. And the people you would put on would be the Inuvialuit, of course, and the various really important research organizations that worked up there. And just figure out the priorities and what the problems were, and then you could direct your money there. But I didn't get it far enough developed in the final agreement, and Simon really didn't understand what I was talking about. So we left it in there in a very, very rudimentary form. It doesn't really say anything. and we got a bit of implementation money. So that was given to Norm to basically run his library. I think that's probably where it sits today. So whether he ever had a library or not, I don't know.
Well, my understanding is they've kind of taken the idea of library a little bit further, in that they've inventoried what they've got, identified some gaps to meet current priorities.
I think it's digitized and put on a server as well. Oh, feel free.
Yeah, we're just kind of chatting.
Oh, can I take a photo now?
Certainly, yeah.
Last time I popped in, I didn't know whether
Oh,
it was
it's okay. It's
great.
informal.
No photographing going on here
Are you
anyway.
getting warm at all?
No, this is great.
Okay, since these,
Yeah.
good
Probably
breeze.
fresh air too.
All right. We'll pretend it's all happening.
Yeah.
So how many enemies have you made? Just kidding.
I don't think I'm making any new ones, but I'm sure bringing up a lot of the old ones.
Yeah, I know when I started with the governor, there was a question about my predecessor, well, the guy who hired me was Bob James, Robert James.
No,
I don't remember him.
don't. I don't.
I remember him asking me if I knew about it, because there's some thought that he was going to be appointed as the research advisor. But the government needed a representative, I don't know.
Yeah.
He would have been a watchful person for
Oh
that.
my God.
Okay, so that was the reasoning, so that the Inuvialuit, in a sense, would really have some control over the
Yeah.
research that was,
Yeah.
even by identifying priorities and
Sure.
inviting others to
Yeah.
gear their research in that direction.
So, anyway, I still think it's got a potential if people want to take advantage of it. You know, I still think that's a worthwhile function. But I don't know. I've always objected to research figuring that they were somehow sacrosanct. You know, they could just go do whatever they wanted, wherever they wanted. Well, I don't think that's right. But that's just me. Hello, my girl. Can't find any lions to fight?
What's up?
This way. You can come through this little,
That's funny, if you won't get through that.
this way. Come on, Lisa, there's a room for you. I guess she's always been too big.
Hello, my girl.
Hey.
Yeah, you're my lion hunter, aren't you? Yeah. When I had that conference call with Peter Green, it was sort of over, you know, with that meeting up there. She'd been sleeping on the couch the whole time, so I took the computer over and I said, "Hey, Peter, this is my hunting dog." She's snoring away.
I'll tell you something. I'll just interrupt for a minute. Bob was in a long, long interview that was all videotaped. You were probably a good part of that, not long ago.
Yeah, okay, right.
Yeah.
And everyone got up and told a story after story. And I was back on the Chesterfield
We saw you.
listening. Oh, you guys tried to
We saw you
hide.
building a boat in the background. Yeah.
Yeah, I tried to hide as much as I could, so I got over it. And then I remember about this. There was one story about something or other, and you know, they're just stories about life and things that happen, all related to something that people wanted to address. The second one, and then the third one, I think it was Mr. Green that you're talking about. He got up and said,
Well, it was Boogie that went on for that real long.
Yeah, quite right.
he got up, and the first thing he said is, "I just about drifted off." Come on, you've never been on there before. You can't get on there now.
Yeah, she's staking her
never been
claim, I
on this
think.
one.
No. Staking her claim.
That's right.
I thought it was so funny when it was the first thing he said. He got up to speak and said, "I just about drifted off."
Yeah, Peter always did talk like that, eh? That deep voice and the slow, deliberate.
Yeah.
The good pauses.
Yeah, so I hadn't known that Peter had moved to Yellowknife.
No, I just learned that. Yeah. Well, he's getting pretty old for life in politics.
Don't show this to my dog.
It's getting nicer by the minute.
I know.
So the dog has to be in the, it's either shade or in the.
Yeah.
No, I'll just keep plugging away, vacuum boxes.
Okay. I'll keep telling lies here.
I was wondering if there's anything else we want to go over today. So let's get in kind of the general framework.
Yeah. Yeah.
To drill down into some other topics tomorrow.
Sure.
Some more details.
Yep. And, you know, as I was telling you, I would like to go through some of the real special parts of the final agreement that people should pay attention to.
Yeah.
You know, what they are, why they're unique. You know, we talked a little bit about that because from my standpoint, that's useful in terms of people understanding. Part of the reason they should be really proud of that agreement. But secondly, those are the areas you really have to protect. So every time the government wants to make an amendment to that final agreement, if it's any of these sections,
Gotcha.
look out, because that's happened once, the last sets of amendments.
What was that? Which amendment?
It was with screening. The exemptions they wrote in there. Absolutely harebrained. And I spotted this right off the bat when I looked at that new agreement. And nobody knew where they came from. Nobody took ownership. And I asked Nellie, and she says, yeah, I know where they came from. Norm Snow and Fred, Game Council Joint Secretariat. And they never took ownership. I confronted them right in that meeting. Again, I mean, I'd asked them on the phone. They didn't know. I confronted them again. No ownership of that. So,
The amendment process, I mean, there's a lot of trivial amendments and they're just kind of editorial.
it's house cleaning. Yeah.
The more substantive ones, there's got to be well, there is a process.
Yeah, there is. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's got to go through IRC. Yeah. But they came to Nellie and said, we want to make these changes. And Norm had financial reasons. Nellie will save a whole bunch of money in the screening committee if we do this. And Fred wanted to do it just to prove that Nellie wasn't the big boss. And so what Nellie told me was, she said, well, look, if you guys really want to do it, you know, you want to do this on your own, okay. You sit down with Roger Connolly and work out the wording. Well, just grates on me. I mean, first of all, it's wrong in principle. This is a right for the Inuvialuit to screen all these things. And the reason not to screen them, the reason they got for the exemption, is absolutely incomprehensible. It's if there's emergency funding, if there's a threat to life, you know, what the hell's that got to do with anything? If there's a permit involved, it's got to be screened. And you can't tell me under emergency funding, like flood control, that there aren't terms and conditions in place for how they go about doing that. You don't just send a bunch of contractors and say, take care of the flood. No. There are permits involved. And they miss out the harvesters completely in these exemptions. You know, part of that screening and review board process is that, sure, damage to environment is one component, but damage to the harvesting is another. Like, you can have things that don't hurt the environment, but really bugger up harvesting. And that's why that's all in there, because you want terms and conditions associated with those things. So they miss that completely. And then they have a third amendment in there giving the screening committee part of the review board's job of saying, basically, if they suggest to the government terms and conditions, then It doesn't have to go to a review board. Well, they can't. Let's just take the whole area of wildlife compensation. That's strictly review board function. Screening committee can't do it. They're not equipped to do with it. And this is all on the basis of trying to save money. Well, that's stupid. Absolutely stupid. But I told you, I warned them that, you know, if government wants to change any of these important areas, don't do it. Or ask somebody that really knows what's going on. Because they're going to come and try to get you. They sure as heck are. And the Yukon's still trying to. But, so basically, if they want to pretend there's going to be a fight about it, and if the Inuvialuit know what they're talking about, they're going to end up in arbitration. And they'll be sorry they did. You know, that's my opinion.
But we'll talk some more about this, Bob, I guess. What it really comes down to is that there need to be people who have the deep understanding of the IFA and all its complexities and
nuances of
and interrelations and everything else.
And that's the one drawback in terms of how that thing is drafted. It's a drawback in the sense of there's so much for an individual to read, even if they understand the words, how it all fits together is the tough part. But, if, you know, that's the price you pay for having a document that's going to endure, and, you know, that's what I was talking about, the enabling part of it. You know that agreement. There isn't anything you can't accomplish, one way or another, using that final agreement. So, that's a pretty powerful tool.
So how does that information get passed on?
That's right. That's right. Well, one of the tools I used in my few workshops I gave, now I gave IRC a workshop, I gave Joint Secretariat a workshop, I gave Parks Canada a workshop, and I gave a couple of others, is that I developed a list of questions. I don't know whether you've seen these, but I passed them on.
74 of them or something.
Yeah, something like some ridiculous number.
Right,
Anyway, my reasoning was the following. Unless you can work with that final agreement to figure the answer out, and you don't have to do this on your own. I mean, put your heads together and try to figure this one out. You won't understand the agreement until you can answer those questions. And, you know, I go back to those questions now. I can't answer half of them because you got to be really fresh. You got to read that agreement and be really current with it. And my advice to anyone who has to practice with that final agreement, if you think you know the final agreement, you probably don't. So get your heads together, figure it out. Because I was saying there's more than one way to solve these problems.
You know, I worked on writing legislation several years ago, and I worked with a team from Justice, but who were assigned to work with Indian Affairs, as it was called at that. And they had kind of the same dilemma. They were responsible for a package, you know, an area of different laws, as it were, but they're all related. And they wonder, same thing, they had to know about high-level working knowledge. If they didn't know the precise answers, they needed to know how to get the answers, right? After all, they were the lawyers.
Yeah.
They're the ones that were supposed to be able to stand up in court. So what they did is they got together every Friday afternoon, and somebody would pose a question to try and trick all the other ones, and it became the next ongoing exercise. How do you analyze the laws and what tools bring in? And of course they come up with different opinions and everything because they're lawyers, right?
Yeah.
And then they debate the merits, the different answers on
Yeah.
it. So it really was it was a social activity, it was an educational activity. You'd really have to be empowered to be able to do that the way you're.
Yeah. Well, I certainly suggested to Norm and the Joint Secretariat a similar idea that, you know, take every Friday afternoon, take some of these questions and really kick them around. Yeah, because that's the only way you're going to learn. And anyway, there's only one person that ever answered all those questions in that workshop. Only one person out of all those hundreds of people that I gave it to. All the rest complained and bitched about it was too hard. Like Norm, he wouldn't do it. Wouldn't even try one. I guess he read them over and said, holy crap. Somebody's going to figure out, I don't know this final agreement.
So somebody tried to answer them all. Did they get the answers right on them all?
No, but that's okay. You know, it was Lindsay. He wrestled through those things. Boy, he was a tenacious guy when it came to that. And so when he was down here, we had this meeting, and we were laughing about the fact that none of us could answer any of these questions anymore, you know. So anyway.
Yeah, so there's some thought of, you know, this particular IFA one, we're getting into tomorrow now. This particular project is geared, you know, for the first target audience would be the current generation, whatever.
Yep.
You know, that. But people want to see this taught in the schools as well, some awareness of the IFA so that it becomes part of your just general knowledge. So that if you get a job later on where you have some responsibilities, it's not a foreign concept. And have these things been talked about? I mean, have you talked about it? What, even going back to the early days of implementation, people thought, how do we keep up with knowledge of this?
Yeah, I was the only one really promoting that. And I couldn't get much traction. I really couldn't. You know, you get a bit here and there, but no. Once Roger Grubin got in there, he didn't want that. I got my land and my money. Don't tell me what the final agreement says, because then it might tell me I can't do what I want to do.
Yeah, but I think it's certainly different now. I get a sense from Dwayne that this is a priority.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, they've got a generation or so of having to work with it and realize that maybe they don't know enough.
Yeah. Well, the other thing is Dwayne mentions we got to realize this is a living document. Not really sure what his concept is, and I want to be nice to get him sitting in front of the camera, and I was hoping we'd be able to do that last time I was up there, but you know, events intervene. Is that a term that was thrown around in your days, that it's a living document?
I never use it, but it's one that I think probably makes sense, because of this whole concept. It's a set of, I call it the toolbox. This is what you work with, you know.
That's right.
Yeah. And it's not just a static, prescriptive thing where you just got to learn all the lines in it and you're going to have it. But so.
It'd also be interesting to hear how you break it down to, let's say, educate a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old on the very basis of what it is.
Yeah.
Right now, but,
That's right. You know, quite frankly, I haven't thought about that problem. I'm more interested in the adults that are in a position of voting and in exercising responsibilities. That's where I've sort of put my thinking. But it's true, it's got to start a lot earlier.
we also have a lot of mixed families where the child is deciding at a certain age.
Sure.
Inuvialuit witching, what's a movie?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, the approach we worked out to date, and I don't know if it'll survive the review, but to create, you know, to encourage people to develop a certain level of awareness of the IFA, is we've identified a number of topics and then pose questions and give some answers. Thinking that if you put the question out there, assuming if you put the question out there, that people then begin to think and incorporate that as a question that they have. And if they get an answer,
Yeah.
through rule seeking, or it's given to them, becomes part of the learning process. So this is one of the paradigms of adult education.
Yeah.
But we're going to run that through a filter now. The next step in working on this program is for the Stratus group, who have access to people that develop adult education programs, to look at it and fine tune it and comment on it as well.
That's good. Yeah.
So I started with your 274 questions and then whittled it down to maybe 25 or so. Rephrase some of them. That's
Sure.
what that list is. You know, it endures. It's being modified, of course, but it's.
Yeah.
And we added a few others in there as well.
Yeah, there are lots of other questions. That was just really designed, as I say, to
It
get
was
people
very-
digging in.
Yeah, a lot of it was specific to,
Yeah.
the workshop too, of
Yeah.
course, with the park in particular.
Yeah.
Some specific questions, but
One of the funny things, Lindsay was always the enthusiastic guy in the workshop, and we had a real early one, and I was sort of asking questions about this, and in terms of land ownership and management, when you talk about alienations, that's where they sell off oil and gas rights, or whether they have a surface lease or something like that. It's called an alienation in land terms. So I just said, well, what's an alienation? And I don't know whether you know Lindsay's background, but he's a sociologist. So I got the whole sociological definition of being alienated. Oh, gosh. And he laughed and laughed. So,
I was thinking we could do a Trivial Pursuit game as well, because there's some things in there that I don't know if they're consequential to anything. And I put one of them on the list, and maybe I'll just ask you right now, only because I'm going to take it into my personal experience. One summer I was doing some research on Banks Island, and we finished that up, and we still had had a crew for about a week, so I said, well, let's just get dropped off where no other archaeologists have ever worked before. We looked at a map, and we decided this place up in northern Victoria Island called Inuvialuit May
oh, yeah.
might be a good place to go spend a few days and look around. And more recently, of course, I noticed that, when doing the land selection and the quantum and working out as
Yeah.
close as you can, any excess land or any extra land would be, I can't remember the word.
Yeah, we had to be within 1%, so
Yeah. So
we just had to say where we were going to select it.
Yeah, so why was we being selected? I mean, it's way out there where nobody seemed
Yeah.
to be using that particular area.
Well, as I said, we got all the land that we really wanted.
Yeah.
And it was up to the Inuvialuit. Well, where else we don't necessarily really want it, but where else might be useful?
Yeah.
So Luana Bay. So. Other than that, I didn't know anything about it. So.
It would make perfect sense today, though, because with the decreasing sea ice, that's where all the maritime traffic's going to be going
I
through.
suppose.
And that's where what your refueling station you're talking about.
Yeah. Boy, I fear for the future up there. Holy smoke.
Yeah, in what way?
Well, this whole climate change business, that's going to change life from us just drastically. And, the thought of potentially not being able to harvest polar bears is just inconceivable to me. But
How about caribou, though? I mean,
yeah, caribou come and go in terms of their problems. I don't know what the effects of climate change would be on caribou. Wouldn't do any good. All the vegetation's going to change, and that's going to affect them probably.
Mm-hmm.
Heat's always been a problem to caribou.
Well, again, my limited understanding, a lot of it is, the uncertainty with the weather is no longer as predictable.
No.
And in the spring, there's increased danger of freezing rain rather than snow.
Yeah, that's deadly.
This is deadly. That Bathurst caribou crash, 10, 12 years
Yeah.
ago, right?
Yeah, Donnie was telling me about that.
There were voluntary restrictions that
Yeah.
I guess the HTC's got together and decided, we got to do something about this. They didn't wait for the government to come in and set
Yeah.
quotas on.
No, I find them pretty responsible in terms of, the management principles.
Mm-hmm. But polar bear nowadays, it's an economic generator for
Oh, yeah.
some people. Now, the money gets spread through the land.
Yeah.
But when you think, when you're saying that you fear for the time when they can't hunt polar bears, is that more
Yeah, well,
sociological thing that you're thinking?
well, sure. But it's just been such a way of life. I mean, that was part of the male status. And, you take Banks Island, if you're a good polar bear hunter, you're a real man.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I think the last I heard, polar bear hunt was about $50,000 a year. Does that sound right? Well, they were about 10,000 when I was up there.
Mm.
But that was still a lot of money.
And the money gets spread through the community too.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I remember we used to have guided Arctic. We do the outfitting for the guides there. We'd get all the clients and ship them up there. And we had this real black guy from the States who wanted to hunt muskox up there. And he was a doctor. And his only condition was, I'm not going to sleep in a tent, so we can only hunt a day's trip. So I can come back and sleep in a warm bed. I just thought, most of these hunters are pretty rough and tumble.
And that's part of the experience.
Yeah, macho guys, Yeah, he was a good guy.
Well, the polar bear certainly is the iconic symbol of the North.
Oh, yeah.
It's,
But most of the market for polar bear hides is, they sell for about, back in those days, about, 8 to 10,000 for a big at auction. You know who bought them? Japanese. You know why? Because they make fishing flies out of the hair.
that's right. There's actually, what was his name? Peterson. Captain Peterson. He ran
Yeah.
the Canadian, or the Canadian Trading Company.
Yeah.
So he retired from the North, moved down to California, and he took a couple of polar bear skins with him. And that was his business, to make these things. But the rumor got around that he was becoming a millionaire, making a lot of money at any rate doing that. This is back, I don't know, probably the 70s perhaps. And 2 guys broke out of a local prison, went over and murdered him and his wife.
Oh, geez.
In the process of looking for the $1 million that he had made selling
I didn't know that.
flies, but using the polar bear hairs.
Just to show you what a small world is, when I was living in Vancouver going to school, Peterson's wife was my landlady. Go figure.
Time up for today?
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah, so I think, tomorrow let's get the messages that you'd like to do
Sure.
on here. Then I've got some specific questions. I'm gonna have to think about some of the things that
Yeah, I've got to
talked
think
about
of
here
the answers
today.
here. Yeah, sounds good. Well, I really enjoyed today, actually.
This is a good day. Good one. Good pace.
Yep.
Good information.
I hope I last through tomorrow. It's getting old to bitch,
Aging is not for sissies. I think we probably talked about this.